Thank you, Palita, and I'm delighted to welcome our distinguished panelists for a discussion of the upcoming UN climate talks at COP26 in Glasgow. It feels like there is a lot at stake at this COP, a lot of really thorny issues, including climate finance, global carbon markets, and crucially, whether the world can cut emissions fast enough to limit global warming to 1.5 or 2 degrees. I'd like to begin by inviting each minister to make a few opening remarks laying out what their country is doing to prepare for Glasgow and what, in their view, would make COP26 a success. And for those of you watching this in the audience, please join in the conversation by typing your questions into the box on your screen. We'll get to as many of those as we can in the second half of our discussion. I'd like to begin with Minister Ribera. In Spain, you've been quite an early mover, one of the first countries in Europe to start talking about net zero. Tell me what you are doing now to prepare for COP26 and what you hope to see in Glasgow.
Hello, good morning and good evening. Very happy to see you all. Yes, we are working and preparing our position towards Glasgow within the context of the European Union. So working together to be as ambitious and as credible as possible. I think that this is also very relevant, being credible on how we ensure the full decarbonization and credible pathways in order to facilitate the transformation, paying attention to the social issues, just transition. We are about to get a new law from the Parliament. We have made a significant change in our energy system, and we are making very significant changes also in connection with land use or biodiversity or social policies, including innovation, research, and labor skills policies. Towards Glasgow, what we expect from Glasgow, I think that we all have some expectations in order to fulfill all the operational needs to get the Paris Agreement fully in place. But then my best effort would be in order to get credible long-term and mid-term pathways from very significant countries so that we can ensure that we all are perceived as governments, as committed governments that do take credible steps towards the full decarbonization. Then I think that it is important to ensure that we can align different policies towards Paris Agreement goals. So when we talk about trade, when we talk about finance, not just, which is very important to fulfill our commitments on climate finance, but also to get consistent response from the finance world, from the finance environment, and to get the right connections with the biodiversity and ocean agenda. So I think that formal agendas coming from governments and strong signals of movement coming from all players in these fields are very important. The main delivery, the long-term fully decarbonization pathways coming from every country. So to count on mid-term consistent goals by 2030 from everybody. Reviewed NDCs that are consistent with the Paris Agreement goals.
Thank you so much, Minister Ribera. Minister Fu, next I'd like to turn to you. Tell me what Singapore is doing to prepare for the COP and what you hope to see in Glasgow.
Thank you very much, Leslie, and good evening. Climate change is really important for Singapore because to us as a small island state, it is an existential threat. So a global challenge like this really requires a global response. We are already feeling its impact and the climate variation is intensifying every year. So there are therefore high expectations for COP26. From our perspective, COP26 will need to first deliver on climate ambition and show that parties collectively can put into words into action so that to help to narrow the emission gap, notwithstanding the challenges of COVID-19. COVID-19 didn't help, I must say. So it is really swimming against the tide, if you like, but we must press on. Second, we need a complete understanding. We have to complete the outstanding negotiations on Article 6 and the enhanced transparency framework. It's very important for us to get a global framework going so that we are on level playing field and that we understand what each other are doing. The third point I'd like to make is really to make progress on climate finance commitments to support the developing countries. This is a very important point because this is an undertaking since Copenhagen, and I think it's important that the developed countries deliver on their promise. And fourth, we need to galvanize global climate actions by all stakeholders, with government, with businesses, with civil societies, working really in partnership to come up with innovative technologies and solutions. As a strong advocate for multilateral, rule-based approach to addressing climate change, Singapore has always worked with other countries at the UN to push for the best multilateral deal on climate change. For any global solution to be durable, I must say that the expectations that it must be inclusive, and therefore it must take into account the interests and concerns of all, and allowing all countries to make a best effort contribution based on their national circumstances and development priorities. The Paris Agreement was built on this basis through a bottom-up system of nationally determined pledges with a robust transparency framework to ensure that everyone is doing their part. A regular ambition cycle was also built into the system to encourage all countries to come forward with more progressive pledges every 5 years. So it is admittedly not perfect, but I think the Paris Agreement is our best bet to address climate change. Our challenge really is to make the system work. And for COP26, we need to encourage all parties to come forward with ambitious pledges, long-term strategies, and also to share concrete implementation plans to achieve that. Singapore is doing our part. Last year, we submitted our enhanced climate pledge and also long-term low emissions development strategy to the UNFCCC, and that's despite the challenges posed by COVID-19. So we have also recently launched a Singapore Green Plan that will chart ambitious and concrete sectoral targets to achieve our net zero emissions as soon as possible. And I will stop here and I would like to share with you later about our plans. But I would like to say that I think the whole world is waiting for COP26. It's not an easy undertaking, but we as leaders must press on.
Thank you so much. You've touched on a lot of the key issues that I hope to dive in more to further in this conversation, including climate finance and the country's pledges. Minister Jorgensen, thank you for joining us. Please tell us a bit about what Denmark is doing to prepare for the COP and what you would like to see happen in Glasgow.
Well, first of all, I think it's important that we acknowledge just how difficult a time it is for almost all countries on the planet right now. We're in the middle of a pandemic. I think it's fair to say that climate change is probably not number one on the agenda in many countries, if any. Obviously, countries are struggling right now to get through this very serious crisis that we're in. Having said, I think that there are reasons to be optimistic. I think most countries acknowledge that the climate crisis is the most serious crisis we face because it will fundamentally change the foundations of life on our planet if we don't tackle it. So even though we are dealing with a crisis that's here right now, that's killing people, and therefore we need to take it very, very serious, which is the COVID-19. We know that potentially the climate crisis is even worse, so we need to do things. And the fact that the US has will re-enter the Paris Agreement, new pledges from China, the pledge from the EU to reduce by 55% in 2030 compared to 1990. That's an increase from 40%. All of these things, I think, gives us reason to be optimistic. Now, from the Danish perspective, we found it important that we would pledge as much as would be necessary for us to live up as an individual country to the Paris Agreement. And we asked the scientists there, so what do you recommend for us to do? And they said 70%. So we've actually now adopted a climate law, a legally binding climate act, that makes it for us necessary to reduce by 70%. It's a little bit of a different way to go about it. Normally, a government would ask what is possible, but this time we've asked what is necessary, and then we need to make the necessary possible, which is going to be quite a difficult task because we need to reduce with as much from now to 2030 as we've done from 1990 until now. So we need to take big steps. We've decided to stop oil and gas extraction in the North Sea. Not an easy decision. We are the biggest oil producing country in Europe, so it's an expensive but necessary decision for us to make. In 2050, we've set the stop date, and we've already now cancelled all future licensing rounds. Also, we are planning to enhance our offshore wind capacity so that in time we'll be able to deliver electricity to 12 million European homes, so many more than we are in Denmark ourselves. So these are some of the things that we can contribute with. And then, of course, we want to be a pragmatic but also idealistic part of the negotiations with our colleagues in Europe, not least my good friend Teresa from Spain, who's also doing great work.
Thank you so much. That's such a fascinating range of perspectives from three very different countries with different circumstances. I'd like to tune in on something that all of you brought up, which is the nationally determined contributions. These are the targets that each country sets as part of the Paris Agreement. Earlier today, I sat down with Patricia Espinosa, the head of UN Climate Change, and she explained that we're very, very far off track from what is needed to meet the Paris target. According to the UN calculations, if you add up all the current pledges, it gets about 1% of emissions reductions by 2030. What we need is closer to 45% emissions reductions by 2030. And my question to you is, do you think that can happen this year? And what are you able to do within your own country and in terms of working with other groups and other countries to make sure that those more ambitious targets happen? Minister Ribera, what's your view? And then I'll come to each of you in turn.
I was very happy to hear Grace and Dan commenting on views that I think are optimistic but realistic. I think that there is a kind of new air entering into the room. The big ones, the small ones, thinking what is the best contribution I can make along the year, in a year which is difficult, in a year where we have got good news coming from different big countries, and that should be used as a lever in order to facilitate an acceleration of the pledges coming from every single country. But I think that this also touches the core of the business community, and I think that this is very important because that could facilitate an acceleration of all the action. I could say that in general terms, we are expected to be credible, as I say, but at the same time, even if in a context of pandemics and post-pandemics, we all are trying to figure out how we can recover some economic activity and how we can better invest in the context of the stimulus package. And I think that this is a very interesting opportunity to ensure that not a single cent is wasted. Every single cent being promoted, being back, should be working towards climate consistency, either in mitigation or in adaptation. And the signals that the governments can provide to the business community, to the investors, to the social communities is huge in that field. And I think that this can explain why this race to zero can be accelerated. Then there is the formal communication to the UNFCCC, which is very important. And I think that the data coming from UNEP or coming from the UNFCCC is terrible. we are far away from what we need. I think that the movement that Denmark has made is very brave, asking the scientists what we should be doing, and then let's see how we can do it, is quite audacious. I don't know if we are all in a position to do a similar movement because the national circumstances can vary, but I think that similar exercise being asked in order to invest in our own societies is quite important. So yes, I think we can still see many movements towards the right direction, towards Glasgow. And my impression is that this is the main target for the president of COP26. He's trying to move, he's trying to push in the different national souls in order to ensure that we all contribute in a higher level of ambition. Energy is a key sector where things are moving quite fast. Mobility is something that is changing dramatically, and the expectations from a cultural perspective are changing also very fast in mobility. And together with that, there are many other aspects that can allow us to increase our ambition in the national communications and contributions we make towards the UN context. Not to forget the importance of counting on a credible and sufficiently ambitious contribution coming from the US by 22nd of April. I think that should be helping others to move to.
Thank you. That's right. The US is expected to announce its target sometime next month. We don't know when yet. Minister Fu, how do you view this question? I know Singapore has a target to peak emissions by 2030. You also have a lot of geographic constraints that govern what you can and can't do. Will Singapore be bringing anything new to the table in terms of an NDC in Glasgow?
Well, actually, the NDCs are very ambitious, as you have rightly pointed out, Leslie, that given our geographical constraints, halving the carbon emissions by 2050 to us is already something that is a big stretch from us. In fact, I think what we are doing is that we are saying that this is what we absolutely have to do, and scientists, please give us the solutions. So we are actually looking for solutions that are not yet here today. Because we just do not have the kind of options of renewables as other bigger countries have. And this is where I think international collaborations is going to be the solution for us, one of the solutions for us. We're looking for technologies that help us get there. And we're going to look at also collaborations such as in the energy area, energy grids from some of our neighboring countries. This is a kind of innovation, both in terms of technology and in terms of policies, that will see us move towards our target. And I think that approach that Singapore has taken is that let's really just start putting our attention, focus sectorally, having all our government agencies within each sector to really think hard about what we need to do. And in fact, we have launched what we call a Green Gov.sg. It's Green Gov for government for short.sg, that basically sets the government public service at an earlier target than the rest of the society. The government will take the lead. We will use our green procurement to influence the products and also the markets that's available. We'll also want to build back a lot more greener and more sustainable than the rest. But back to your question, Leslie, about getting commitments and also from other countries. Indeed, I think COVID-19 has really not helped in this discussion, because the countries are facing challenges both in terms of public health and also economic situation. But we are doing our part to try to put this agenda in the spotlight. So we have called, for example, I have called on my counterparts in the region. I have discussed climate change issues with them. And also at the COP presidencies have really been really hardworking to get the momentum going. We have several meetings, although it's on Zoom, it's on technological platform. But I think it's keeping all of us focused, even as there are many distractions ahead of us. And we are hopeful that when we are able to come together to build on the capability side of things, more countries will be able to to submit their NDCs and also their LDDS. In that way, we are also doing some capability building in Singapore, working with partners such as New Zealand, such as UNFCCC. We are conducting courses for the officials in the region so as to understand the rule book of Paris Agreement better. So it's really to encourage the countries to look seriously on this issue. And I'm hopeful with the US new administration, also with China, Japan, and Korea in Asia announcing ambitious targets. I think it will make leaders, pay attention and focus on this area. So I think that we need to keep pressing. We need to continue to call on leaders, to call on the relevant ministers to all do our part. This is one area where we have to have a global understanding in order for us to move everyone forward. I'm really encouraged by what Minister Jorgensen has done in Denmark, and really this will be a role model for us. And I think this is how I think we should approach this. Each one of us do our very best under our respective circumstances, and having a transparent system to report, to share our findings with one another, and that's how we can move the world forward.
Thank you so much. And thanks to those of you in the audience who are sharing your questions. We will get to those, as many of those as possible. There's already a few questions on the NDCs, including one question that says, what will government's response be if the sum of nationally determined contributions at the end of COP is still not aligned to the Paris goals? And Minister Jorgensen, I'd like to turn to you. What would you like to add on the NDCs and this question of what can happen if there's not enough? So we may have some audio confusion here. I hope everyone can still hear. We seem to have
having some
popped in, but it will get sorted out in just a second.
It is a topic that attracts attention and participation.
That's right. Everyone wants to join in the conversation.
Maybe.
Yes, that's right. Yes.
To respond
This is how the NFCCC will be.
Okay, should I try and answer?
Morgan,
Yeah.
Yes, please go ahead. Yeah.
Well, basically, I have 3 points that I'd like to make in relation to that question. First one is, I think countries to see this challenge as an opportunity. And I know that might sound like a cliche, but nonetheless, if we look at what the European Union has decided to do, I think we were quite many that feared that with the pandemic hitting Europe and the rest of the world, that what had been envisioned and planned on the green transformation would risk being set to a halt. But the opposite happened. The European Commission chose to say, well, this is actually a growth strategy for Europe. We need to see this as an opportunity for us to create an economy that's also competitive in the future. And if you look at it that way, then really this becomes a race to the top instead of a race to the bottom. It becomes a question about who is it that develops the new technology that the rest of the world wants to use. Who is it that becomes independent of fossil fuels, expensive fossil fuels, the fastest? And that would then lead me to the second point. If we could start setting targets that are actually a little bit more ambitious than we know how to reach. So normally in politics, you'd always make an impact assessment, definitely in the European Union, and then you say, okay, so this is what the impact assessment shows us we can, so we better be a little bit less ambitious than that because things can go wrong. Why not take it the other way around and say, we need to push ourselves. So we need to set targets that are higher than the impact assessment shows us we can. And if we do that, then I promise you the countries that that will do that first will benefit from it in the future, because we have a whole planet, we have a whole world that will demand these new solutions. And my third point would be, okay, so I do acknowledge we are in very different situations, and 2030 is just around the corner. It's difficult. So even though we'd like very ambitious NDCs there, if a country for some reason cannot do that, then at least pledge to the carbon neutrality in 2050, because all countries need to do that. If all countries don't, then we don't have a chance, I'm afraid, to keep temperature increases to an acceptable level.
You mentioned how difficult it is because of the coronavirus pandemic, the economic recession that many countries have experienced, how challenging that makes it to move forward on dealing with climate change. And that's very closely linked to this question of climate finance and the 100 billion that was pledged in 2020 to help countries make the transition. I'd like to ask all three of you whether you're worried about that goal not being met, and whether your countries will be stepping up and getting involved with bigger pledges down the road. I don't know who'd like to take that first. Minister Jorgensen, back to you.
Yes. Well, you asked me, am I worried? Yes, I am. I think it's a disgrace, to be honest with you, that the richest countries on this planet haven't done what they promised many years ago, and I do think that it has hurt the trust in the whole process. And I think that if we are to get also all the rules that we want on transparency, if we are to get all the pledges that we want from developing countries, the countries that are hit the worst by climate change already now, not in the future, that'll be even worse, but already now they're hit, then obviously the developed countries needs to pay what they promised. So my own country, we have more than doubled what we are paying. So we're doing our part, but I think Europe is doing the same. But unfortunately, there are too many countries that are not doing that. So I think that's probably the key issue, because if we don't solve that, then I don't think we'll solve the other issues.
Yeah, that's a fairly dire assessment. Minister Ribera, what's your view on this climate finance question?
I want to comment on this, but also I want to pick your previous question, because I think that the most important thing is not whether there is a deadline. I think that this is a must, and we should be ongoing under any circumstance. And part of our responsibility as governments is to create the conditions to ensure that things get faster. And this applies, of course, to the mitigation efforts, and we have experienced that in Spain. So when 1 year and a half ago, we stated ambitious goals in reduction of emissions of the non-industrial sectors up to almost 40% from now to 2030, or final use of energy in terms of renewable energy being used in the final use up of over 42%, and energy efficiency in a similar range. People thought that was very ambitious, and now we are asked to do more. I think that the societies, when they understand how important it is, they push the government. So it's our responsibility towards our societies to create the conditions to move forward. And this also applies to the finance question. I think that it is very important to deliver on what we have already agreed a long time ago towards climate finance in the context of the UNFCCC. But that's not enough. I insist on that. There are lots of private banks or development banks that still have not fully integrated the do not harm principle when dealing with climate. We cannot think in a development that is not consistent with climate prosperity. And I think that we need to shift from what we've got up to now, a kind of boutique flow consistent with climate demands, and lots of financial flows that do harm our climate. So I think that, yes, of course, we need to deliver in the 100 billion question, but what it is much more important is to deliver on what the Paris Agreement was demanded, full consistent full consistency with all financial flows towards climate security. And I think that we are witnessing a much more higher involvement of the finance community, but still far from what we need. So how we can make these portfolios evolve towards low, fully decarbonized portfolios, how we can make attractive to invest in climate resilient solutions and development prosperity solutions. And I think that these are challenges for Glasgow. We will not deliver at the very end or at the very last detail on these needs, but we need to set a clear framework that is consistent and creates the positive envy to make this happen quite soon.
That's so interesting. So it's not about the deadline necessarily, but making sure that all financial flows are consistent with the Paris Agreement and everyone's moving in the right direction. Minister Fu, I'd love to hear your thoughts on climate finance, and then we'll go to audience questions. Thanks so much to all of you that have asked questions. Feel free to chime in and type your question in the box. But first, Minister Fu, what would you like to see on climate finance?
I totally agree with the other two ministers. There are the countries out there in the island, low-lying islands that are really suffering the effects of climate change right now. This is not a 2030 problem or 2050 problem. This is really a current problem for them, a current challenge. On the other hand, also, I do see that there's been disappointment in meeting the obligations under climate finance. On the other hand, I would like to say that there has been positive movements. I totally agree with Mr. Teresa that that not all financial institutions or development banks have been fully consistent in their sustainability targets. But on the other hand, we are also seeing how some significant movements in that area where investors, banks, that are putting, sustainability targets and ESG targets on their investments and on their loan portfolios. For example, in Singapore, the DBS group actually has a target to go $50 billion by 2024. And also our sovereign investment company, Temasek, also has put sustainability as a key requirements on their investment companies. So these are positive movements, but obviously there's still gap to deal with finance needed for climate adaptation, for example. How do you deal with a very immediate problem with rising sea level that some countries are facing? These are gaps that we need really international solutions. And this is where I think having a agreed framework that can set high enough targets for the financial institutions as well as for global carbon setting systems. I think this is important for us, in order for us to meet our obligations under the Copenhagen COP.
Thank you so much. You mentioned adaptation and some of the impacts on low-lying islands, and we actually have an audience question on adaptation. The question is, given the lag in climate effects from greenhouse gases is approximately 30 years, is investment in adaptation logical or appropriate if it detracts from investment in mitigation? Who would like to take that question about the trade-offs? Is there a trade-off between investing in adaptation or mitigation?
I'd like to have a go at it. I think we have investment in both areas, both in mitigation and adaptation. I think we need to do that because Singapore is a small island, 700 square kilometers. We actually had no alternative highlands to move to. So it is important for us to start thinking about it, start understanding, start studying the effects so that we have enough lead time. Because to have mitigation and to have adaptation measures, obviously it's going to take a lot of time. It's also going to take resources. On the other hand, we're looking at mitigations. And I think this is where the collaboration with institutions, with companies, with financial sector players, these are all important areas where there is a room for technology, for resources, for capital resources to find its place in what we do on a day-to-day basis. So, for example, in the area of moving into solar energy, we believe that yes, government may need to come in and seed some of these investments, but when there's a scale, companies will come in. There will be technology adoption, as Minister Jorgensen has mentioned. This for the companies and for the countries who are proactive and progressive, they will see that this is a new business area. So I think that we have to handle both situations. We have to take a both offensive position and look at new areas of growth for our people. At the same time, we shouldn't keep our eyes off a defensive area, such as for Singapore. We just have to look at some of the adaptation measures going forward, because we are feeling the effect as of now. We are getting the hottest and wettest month in 1 year last year in Singapore. So being a low-lying country surrounded by water, having, it's just going to rain again this afternoon. And you have read about floods in many parts of this world. We have to be responsible and take actions as well. So we have to learn to do both, hopefully equally well. And then at the same time, look at really opportunities where private sector, where NGOs can play a part.
Yeah. We only have a few minutes left in our session, so I'm going to try to go through these questions very quickly by combining two of them. One question is, can we target behavioral change like using less as the prime target for net zero instead of generating more? Have COVID-19 restrictions indicated how this might be achieved? Another question says, the other question is, when will we treat emissions the way we treat public health, like elimination strategies, tracking, tracing, emergency measures, nightly press conferences, and so on? The question says, climate change is here right now and killing people right now. Who'd like to address those? Minister Ribera, I see you nodding along. And Minister Jorgensen, over to you next.
Okay, thank you, Leslie. And I love this idea of being offensive in those channels, in the two channels, both adaptation and mitigation. And I could add domestic and international finance. It won't be possible to be resilient if others do not mitigate. It could not be possible to achieve the full decarbonization without investing in resilience. So I think that it is important to work to avoid situations that depend and rely on others. And I think that this also happens at the very individual level. I think that, as I said, we need to create the conditions to make it easier, but behavioral changes are very important. And it is a question of attitudes and values. And of course, we need to promote a different way to produce and a different way to consume from the institutional and regulatory context, but that's not enough. I think that there is a question of public awareness, a question of education, but also a question of assessing priorities in a different manner. And probably this is one of the lessons we can draw from these pandemics. People has come back to the very basic primary values: my family, my home, my very close context, how healthy it is, how we can ensure that we can live with this menace, this threat that makes us to be much more humble on how we can react. And I think that this is something that should be helping in changing these behaviors when talking about what we eat, how we move, and so on, how much energy we consume, and how we dress every single day. I think that this is important, and this is happening. And the other comment it has been raised is the linkage with health issues. I think that this is very true and very important, and this is a very good way to introduce this debate into the public agenda. We have experiences connected to biodiversity and the zoonosis and so on, and it has been connected to air quality. But I think that there are many other references to climate menaces or a lack of adaptation and resilience to climate impacts that do make us think in terms of health. So yes, I think we should be using these arguments in order to promote a higher ambition, both in mitigation and adaptation.
Thank you so much. And Minister Jorgensen, would you like to add anything on the role of behavior change?
Well, there's no doubt that that does play a role. Need to change the way we not only produce as a society and companies produce, but also how we individuals behave. I have to say, though, that if we've learned something from the pandemic, I think it probably, unfortunately, is that even if we fundamentally change, for instance, the way we travel, it really doesn't make that much of a difference. It really isn't enough. Imagine we've more or less closed down societies, and still that hasn't led to the decreases in emissions that we need. So this, I think, also needs to teach us a lesson that really shouldn't kid ourselves and tell ourselves that if we just fly a little bit less, if we just eat a little bit less meat and so forth, we will solve these problems. No, we need fundamental structural changes. Also, we need to remember that even if all of us that are now part of the problem because we're consuming a lot start to consume less, the planet and the whole population of the planet as a whole will consume more before 2050 because there will be almost 10 billion people on the planet in 2050, and a higher frequency of that population will be richer, hopefully, than they so that they will be able to afford to have air condition, they'll be able to travel more, they'll be able to afford to eat meat a few times a week and so forth. So yes, looking at behavior as a part of the solution. The biggest, I think, a challenge is to make sure that we make civilization green, that we make food production green, that we make energy efficiency just a part of everything we do, that we make renewables replace fossils and so forth. Because if we don't do that, then it doesn't really matter how much we change our behavior, it will not.
That's a sobering thought, but a great note to end on. Just one final question from me to each of you. We only have a few seconds left. So if you could tell me in one or two sentences, do you think that the world will succeed in meeting the goals of the Paris Agreement? Can we limit global warming to well below 2 degrees or 1.5? Yes or no? In one sentence or less. Minister Rivera, what's your view?
We'll do our best. I think that it is very important. To me, it is an existential issue, and it is something that we will be challenged for in case we do not succeed by our own children, not our grandchildren, our children. So I think that there is no a possible no to your question, but how to work to be sure that we manage to get it.
Thank you, Minister Fu.
It's I think that we should not focus just on one point in time, because this is going to be a long journey. If we're looking at 2050, obviously, I think at each point of time, we're really going to try our darnest best to seek for the change that we want. And also, every part of the journey is going to be hard work, but I think we should really give our very best to make a change.
And Minister Jorgensen?
Depends which day you are. So today I'm going to choose to be an optimist. Had you asked me yesterday, I would have probably said no, we won't make it. Listen, if we have a rational approach, if you just analyze what's been adopted in country prospects, what do we need, what's the uncertainty in the scientific community, and you'd conclude it's probably even worse. The problem is probably worse than we think. If you add all those things together, it's difficult to be an optimist. We are politicians. We are here because we think we can change things. We can actually make a difference. we see positive signs all the time. Governments that have moved, people in the street demanding action. So in order to maintain my mental health, I'm going to choose to be an optimist and say yes, of course we can, but we do need to change fundamentally the course that we're on now.
Thank you. Well, thank you so much to the three of you. This has been a fantastic discussion. Thanks to those in the audience, and thank you for your questions. I'm sorry we didn't get to finish all the questions. That's all we have time for today, but it's really been a pleasure and a fantastic discussion. Thank you.
Thank you.